G'day, I'm Rob Malicki and welcome to this episode of Mobility 101, and today we're talking about the way Australian universities structure their student mobility programs. You're going to find out all about how different institutions structure their programs, and by the end of this video you're going to have a much better idea about how this industry is organised. I've been consulting with Australian universities for about 15 years and have basically consulted with every institution in the country, so we've got some really good information to come, and it all starts right now. Each university describes its study abroad section, its student mobility unit, somewhat differently. Traditionally, these units used to be called things like Study Abroad and Exchange or the Student Mobility Office. Now the language has evolved, so it's much more around things like Global Student Mobility or International Study Opportunities. We also have language, things like Learning Without Borders, that are much more broad terms rather than the kind of niche term of student exchange. And that's of course because student mobility, inbound and outbound, has evolved so much in the last couple of decades. It's no longer just about that semester exchange experience, but it's also about short-term experiences and more practical experiences like internships and volunteering. Let's talk about inbound study abroad, because inbound and outbound most often are co-located inside a student mobility unit inside universities. So what about inbound study abroad? In some institutions, inbound study abroad is fully managed by the student mobility unit. In other institutions, some functions of study abroad, such as the admissions, the recruitment of students, and then the student support side of things, are managed by separate units. Those separate units might be within an internal international office structure, or they may be handled completely separately by other parts of the universities. For example, the marketing section of the university might have overall responsibility for marketing study abroad. But traditionally, student mobility has encompassed both inbound and outbound student exchange as well as fee paying. In this section, we're going to talk about inbound and outbound semester exchange programs. And most commonly, these types of programs are handled together by a single unit of the institution. Traditionally a student mobility section like Global Learning or similarly named unit. For having these units co-located is that of course an inbound and exchange programs are two sides of the same coin, so when it comes to dealing with partners and managing balances, these are all part of the same pie. Inbound programs, some functions of that are handled by other units of the institution. So, for example, agreement management might be handled by either a central international relations unit or a separate unit of the university simply responsible for agreements, and things like student support, marketing and the like, admissions, may also be supported by other units of the institution. Traditionally, outbound exchange is fully managed by a central student mobility unit. However, some functions may also be outsourced. And for example, we're talking about things like OS help processing or enrolment of students might be handled by a central enrolment unit. One of the fundamental questions that institutions tend to ask is how to divide up the caseload of their student exchange advisors. Is it better to have one advisor handling all your inbound students and another handling all your outbound students? Or is it better to have one advisor looking after a particular set of countries and regions and another advisor looking after other regions and countries, and doing both inbound and outbound for those partners? And the answer is, it kind of depends. It depends if you're interested in having more efficient, focused processes, or whether you're more interested in your staff having deeper knowledge of a particular partner or region. So let's break that down a little bit. Let's start by thinking about processes. Processes, for example, for inbound can be very different to those for outbound, and the cycle, the business cycle for those processes is very different as well. When we're handling inbound students, particularly study abroad fee-paying students, but also inbound exchange, the cycle tends to overlap with the lull period for outbound. And what that means is if you have an advisor that is handling both inbound and outbound, they never really get a break in their business cycle. Inbound also tends to trump outbound in many, many cases. So when things get really busy, let's say that it's peak inbound student management period, but it's also peak outbound student recruitment period, outbound student recruitment tends to get pushed to the side, which means that that marketing function of outbound is often moved aside. So processes, when you divide inbound and outbound separately, your processes can be much more targeted, much more effective, and balls don't tend to get dropped. Of course, that means on the partner side of things, your university partners overseas have two different people that they need to deal with. Let's look at the other option now, which is about having advisors who are looking after both inbound and outbound for a particular country or region. The advantage of this situation is that, of course, they get to form really deep partnerships and relationships with overseas institutions. They end up with really detailed knowledge of those institutions which they manage. That's, of course, fantastic, both in terms of servicing the inbound students and understanding where they're coming from, as well as being able to advise the outbound students about everything they need to know about a particular partner institution. The downside is, of course, that when things get really busy on the inbound side, outbound tends to get dropped. And when things get really busy on the outbound side, inbound tends to get dropped. We're trying to work out whether or not we're more interested in having focused, efficient processes or a deeper knowledge of our partnerships and the institutions with which we work. Now let's talk about outbound short-term programs. In the last decade or so, particularly, the diversity of international study opportunities for Australian students heading out has really exploded. We've gone from the focus being really on outbound semester exchange, then to outbound short-term exchange, summer and winter schools with partner universities, to now a really broad range of programming types, such as academic programs through third-party providers with universities overseas, study tours, internships, volunteering, conferences, leadership activities, and the like. Now, typically, short-term exchange options, that's your summer and winter schools run at your partner institutions, are managed by central mobility units. When it comes to other types of outbound mobility experiences, study tours, internships, volunteering, these types of programs are quite evenly managed across different universities, either centrally, some institutions manage them centrally, or a mix of both central management and faculty management. And that makes sense because things like study tours or internships, work integrated learning, are more embedded in degree programs and therefore require more faculty contact. There's no right or wrong in this. All it means is that wherever you have more decentralized management of students and programs, there's a greater need for strong communication and better reporting to ensure that we're picking up all the students who are traveling abroad and making sure that they're being adequately prepared for their experience. Let's talk about scholarships now for outbound students. Typically, those universities that run scholarship programs manage those scholarships centrally. So whether we're talking about institutional scholarships here. However, they do often have support from a central finance unit. That might be simply in terms of paying students those grants. It might be right down to the selection of students as well. The finance sections of universities are very important stakeholders in those scholarships, as are, in the case of things like the New Colombo Plan, the scholarships units of universities, the central scholarships unis, the careers offices of institutions, and the alumni units as well. These are three sections of the institution where even if the vast majority of work around New Colombo Plan scholars, not mobility program, but scholars, is being managed centrally, interacting with those other major units, careers, alumni, scholarships, and finance, allows us to delegate out work that isn't particularly relevant to, or not that it's not relevant, work that is mastered by other parts of the institution, so that student mobility can really just focus on the student mobility side of things and let the experts around the institution also play a role in helping those students to have incredible experiences. Let's talk about OS Help. Over half of Australian institutions have OS Help managed by a finance or central administrative unit of the institution. That means the student mobility section is only peripherally involved in students accessing OS Help. How and why? Why? Well, firstly, those central units, whether it's like a student central admin or a student finance unit, they do this stuff day in, day out. They're familiar with executing processes. They're highly familiar with Commonwealth assisted, the Commonwealth assistance schemes. Therefore, this is their bread and butter. In this case, mobility units are still really responsible for promoting OS Help and making sure that students are aware of how it works and are going to those central units at the correct time in the management process to access the scheme. For those institutions where OS Help is managed all in-house, what we see is that the workload can be really high. And what's critical for institutions that do have centrally managed OS Help by the student mobility team is that they set very strict cycles around how and when that OS Help is managed. We strongly recommend that institutions think about having like a monthly or at most bi-monthly process where those OS Help applications are internally managed, assessed, etc., before being sent off to be paid by, for example, a student admin unit. The reason is that students need financial certainty about their overseas study experience, and so getting back to them quickly to tell them that yes, you're eligible and yes, you're going to be getting this funding is really important in enabling students to have international study experiences. let's talk about credit approval. And this is an area that has an enormous amount of complexity across the various institutions. So what I would recommend that you do is download a copy of the University Student Mobility Team Structure Guide, which is available for Global Society partners, and the link will be on this page. And this explains how different institutions handle credit approval for both exchange and non-exchange mobility programs. The range of approaches is varied. Some universities handle this credit approval process almost exclusively as a process between the student, an academic approver, whether it's an academic themselves or an administrator in the faculties, and a central student administration unit. Other institutions are heavily involved with students in selecting units, reaching out to relevant faculty to have those courses approved, and actually processing the enrolment itself. I would advocate that having less involvement in this process is probably better because it's incredibly time consuming. And realistically, what we want is that the experts on both curricula and admission of students into particular units of study, they're the ones that handle those enrolments rather than us as mobility practitioners being deep down in the weeds. So ideally, we have a situation where student mobility units are supporting students, telling them where to go to get information and advising them on the process, but their hands are out of the actual process of getting credit approved and signed off and then transferred when they get back. A lot more details in the guide, so download that and check it out. Let's talk about the role of faculty staff in supporting student mobility. In the study that we did that led to the best practice guide, which you can download from the Global Society's resources for staff, we actually talked to universities, and 3/4 of them told us that they had staff members out in various faculties who had some sort of role overseeing student mobility. So that might be, for example, supporting students inbound or outbound with credit for their exchange program. It could be staff helping to develop and operate the New Colombo plan or study tours, or even work integrated learning staff. 3/4 of universities did have staff in faculties that had some sort of student mobility role. Why is this important? Because these are the guys that are critical in terms of creating a link between students, central units, and faculty. So having awesome communication with them is absolutely paramount if we want to have great relationships around the university and get more students to study overseas. And that's what we're all here for. Lastly, common challenges that universities face with the structure of their programs. And largely, there are no surprises here. Communication is always really tough. When you have not only internal staff within, for example, a student mobility unit working on inbound and outbound programs, but you then have faculty staff, maybe other central administrative units working on it, communication breaks down really quickly. The easiest way to solve this is either to set up some sort of regular reporting scheme, maybe a monthly report that gets circulated by various units, or of course like some sort of once in a quarter catch up between various units in order to really get aligned around how things are progressing with mobility. Technology is another major barrier for institutions because largely student mobility technology has lagged behind technology for other parts of the institution. So what we end up with is a situation where a lot of processes are still handled manually, either by students or by staff, and it's costing everybody a lot of time. It also increases the risk of us having either user-generated errors or simply things getting dropped. Whereas if we implement good technology, great systems, great processes, and technology to automate wherever we can, that of course makes things a lot simpler. Credit approval is another one of the areas where there are challenges between institutions because different faculties might have different preferences for the way that credit is approved and how credit is transferred into a degree. So that's obviously something that you want to get sorted out at a very high level. Finally, it comes down to the advising of students. How do we best convince students to participate on programs and advise them on their programs to make sure that they are the best prepared that they possibly can be? Student mobility units obviously take a major role in this kind of process, but faculties have a really important role to play as well. Having very clear, documented processes that can be handed to students that explain, okay, now you need to get credit approved, you need to go to this faculty and talk to this person. Great, now you need OS help, you need to go over to the central admin unit and talk to this person. Makes life so much easier for students. It's also great for those of you who are members of the Global Society institutions. Your students can access our online Facebook group, which is really enormous and has students from all of your institutions who can help doing that peer-to-peer kind of advising to reduce workload. We also have a really wide array of resources that you as staff members of our partner institution can access. Everything from marketing student mobility programs through to advising students on particular issues through their pre-departure and their re-entry. Those resources can be used not only by central student mobility units, but also by faculty staff and even central administrative units. So use the resources. Inside your staff membership, you'll see a link to our resource library, and in there you will literally find tons and tons of content that explains everything that students and staff need to know about studying overseas. Lastly, grab yourself a copy of the University Student Mobility Team Structures Guide, have a read through, and it tells you very clearly what different institutions are doing, and that might allow you to have some new ideas on different ways that you can structure your mobility team in order to help more students to study overseas. Thanks for joining me. Have yourself an awesome day.